So now it should be fine. Okay, cool. So the problem is a perennial one, known as the problem of universals. And the basic question is this. In addition to concrete particular things, right, things like this cup of coffee, this water bottle, are there general abstract things that these particular things might share or have in common or instantiate? So here's an example. Consider the Sun and Neptune. This is not to scale. These are two particular things, right? There's a particular star and a particular planet. In addition to these two particular celestial bodies, is there the property of being round that they both instantiate, right? So the property of being round, it seems, isn't some other particular thing like the Sun or Neptune. It's not some particular round thing. Rather, it's the general abstract thing that all round things have in common. And the problem is just, here are two answers. Yes, if you say yes, you're a Platonist. If you say no, you're a nominalist. Why is this a problem? When we think about these two answers, we get into a certain kind of dilemma. On the one hand, our ordinary ways of speaking and thinking about things seem to commit us to Platonism, right? So for instance, I can say such things as, there's some way that both the Sun and Neptune are, namely round, right? And this seems to commit us to saying, well, there is, in addition to these particular things, these general things, like the property being round, that particular things instantiate. But on the other hand, when we try to actually figure out what these things are and how they're related to the particular things and how we might be related to them so as to know about them, we're faced with such difficult philosophical problems that it leads us to rethink our answer of saying yes to them in the first place. So we find ourselves going back and forth between these two horns of the dilemma, between Platonism and nominalism. So this is the sort of traditional problem of universals. Nowadays, not that many contemporary philosophers are really that invested in the traditional problem of universals. But I take it that the problem is still there in contemporary philosophy. So on the one hand, if you read contemporary philosophy papers, you'll find lots and lots of philosophers talking about properties, different kinds of properties, what analyses, what you should give of these different properties, and all of this. Property talk is sort of ubiquitous throughout contemporary philosophy. On the other hand, when you actually survey philosophers about what their positions are, more philosophers claim to be nominalists than Platonists. So this is from the 2020 Phil Paper survey, where they surveyed over 1,000 contemporary philosophers, and one of the questions was, what's your position on abstract objects? Platonism or nominalism? As you can see, less philosophers accept Platonism than nominalism. But given the widespread appeal to properties in contemporary philosophy, you would think that Platonism would be by and far ahead. What's the result? Well, it's just the traditional problem of universals, right? It's just the same problem incarnated in contemporary philosophy. So it seems clear that appealing to properties, articulating philosophical theories in terms of properties is extraordinarily useful. As Peter Van Inwagen might say, we can't get by without it. Nevertheless, there's no account of them that avoids the traditional philosophical problems associated with such things, right? So you have this divide between practice and theory in contemporary philosophy. Okay, so here's the aim of this talk. It's to provide an account of properties that does not face the traditional metaphysical and epistemological problems associated with Platonist or realist theories of properties. And to do this, I'll be drawing on what's known as an inferentialist account of content. This is something I've spent a lot of time working on. I'm not going to go that much into the details about inferentialism today, but I want to draw on this account of content to provide a satisfying account of properties. What's the account going to be? This is just a very brief sketch. Properties are modal profiles that things might have, or else I'll say might not have as well. So for instance, something's being some way, right? Something's being some way, something's having some property, is going to be understood in terms of what something's being that way, for instance, necessitates its doing or being, or generally implies that it will do or be, or precludes it from doing and being or being. So this will be the view, and the advertisement for this view is that if you endorse a view of this sort, which can be formally spelled out in an inferentialist theory of content, then you get an account of properties that that on the one hand can accommodate the vast number of properties that are actually appealed to in contemporary philosophy, but doesn't fall prey to the traditional epistemological and metaphysical problems associated with such things. Okay, so that's the aim. Let me start by just substantiating my claim that appeal to properties is just ubiquitous in contemporary philosophy. And I'm going to talk about just two fields of philosophy where it seems like properties play a very important role, not just in formulating the theories, but in actually spelling out these theories. So I'm going to talk about philosophy of mind and philosophy of language, and just say a few things about how properties are appealed to. So here's Jeff Speaks. This is the first sentence of his book, Phenomenal and Representational. He says, "It is now standard to think about perception in terms of two sorts of properties, phenomenal properties and representational properties." Now you might think, reading a sentence like this, okay, well maybe this is just convenient shorthand and this is compatible with Platonism and nominalism. But when you actually look into the debate, you see that not only are properties playing a central role in framing the debate, but they're actually appealed to as playing a crucial explanatory role in spelling out the various positions in the debate. So consider Adam Pautz's statement of one of the positions in this debate, representationalism, which is the thought that phenomenal properties are really to be understood as a special kind of representational property. Here's what he says, I'll read this quote. So, suppose you hallucinate a blue ball, right? So it seems to you that there's a thing before you with the properties of being bluish, being round, and being before me, right? So I suppose I'm hallucinating a red ball, being before you. I don't know. So there seems to you that there is this thing with these properties, yet as a matter of fact, these properties do not characterize any physical thing in your environment or your brain. How is this possible, right? Here's the representationalist view. So when you hallucinate a blue ball, nothing before you really has the properties of being bluish, being round, or being before you. Still, these properties exist. Representationalists propose that your hallucination consists in your phenomenally predicating such properties as a result of aberrant activity in your visual system, in the absence of anything that really has these properties. So this is a proposal, right, about what hallucination consists in. And notably, right, Pautz's statement, right, this is a view in philosophy of mind, right, this representationalist view about philosophy of mind, his statement of the position involves an explicit affirmation of the Platonist position in metaphysics, right? He says these properties exist. And in some sense, if you think through it, you can see they kind of have to exist because they're being appealed to explain what hallucination, which is a real event that happens in the world, right? People hallucinate. What hallucination consists in involves the phenomenal predication of these properties, right? So if there's no properties, this account of hallucination, it's hard to make sense of what this account could even be, right? So this is an appeal to properties in the philosophy of mind. There's a whole bunch of appeals. I just picked one to give an example. Let's consider appeals to properties in the philosophy of language. Here's Jeff King on two facts that a semantic theory must explain. Here's one fact, known as productivity. Speakers can produce and understand novel sentences. And understanding, this is just a quote from King, understanding consists, at least in part, in grasping the truth conditions of the sentence, which often involves properties, objects, properties, and relations. Here's another aspect of semantic competence that a semantic theory must explain. Speakers make robust judgments about the truth and falsity of sentences, taken relative to context and circumstances of evaluations, where such judgments are based on whether certain objects possess certain properties and stand in certain relations in those circumstances. Okay, so this is very abstract, but let me just give you an example. Here's a sentence. The 8th planet from the sun is round. Now, I don't know, you might not know exactly which planet the 8th planet from the sun is, but you know whichever planet it is, it's a planet, and planets are round, right? And in virtue of grasping that fact, you grasp the truth of this sentence. You know that this sentence is true, right? So your knowledge of the truth of this sentence seems to involve your knowledge that the 8th planet from the sun is round, whatever planet it is, whatever the 8th planet from the sun, whatever planet it is a planet, and planets are round, right? So this is just one example of how appealing to your cognitive grasp of properties, it seems like plays an essential role in the explanation of your judgments of the truth conditions of novel sentences, right? So I've just mentioned sort of two ways in which contemporary philosophers appeal to properties in actually spelling out philosophical theories. And I picked philosophy of mind and philosophy of language because properties play a very essential role in these philosophical theories, serving as the contents of our predicative thoughts and expressions. So what are properties? So insofar as we think of properties as the things that are capable of playing this role in philosophical theorizing, what kind of account of properties do we need? So there's a traditional debate that I don't want to get into, but I will mention, whether properties are to be understood as general entities, these are so-called universals, or particular entities, often called tropes. Now, I don't want to get into the metaphysics of this debate, but let me just say the Fregean view, the traditional view in philosophy of language, is that the contents of predicate expressions like round are general entities that might be predicated of and instantiated by different particular things. And in contemporary philosophy of language and also philosophy of mind, lots of philosophers influenced by the Fregean tradition assume this conception of properties. And just to give you a little justification for it, consider this phenomena which we might call predicative same-saying. And this is something that Peter van Inwagen emphasizes in his discussions of properties. I can say of the sun that it's round, and you can say the same thing about Neptune, right? That seems like a true sentence. You can say the very thing about Neptune that I say about the sun. If I say that it's round and you say of Neptune that it's round, we've said the same thing about two different things. And given that we both say something true, it seems that there is some way for something to be, such that I predicated it of the sun, you predicated it of Neptune, it's instantiated by the sun, and it's also instantiated by Neptune, right? So this, I take it, is sort of a truism, but if we take such descriptions as face values, it seems like we should take properties to be general things. Now, as I said, I'm not going to enter in the details of the traditional debate about properties as particulars or properties as general things. I'm just sort of going to appeal to these intuitions and the way that they're appealed to in contemporary philosophy of language, to say, all things being equal, if we could get an account of properties as general things, that would be preferable, because we could just say such things on the face of it. So that's one constraint, I take it, of a theory of properties that meets these, the demand for the appeals to these properties. Here's another constraint, I take it. David Lewis makes a distinction between sparse or natural properties on the one hand and abundant properties on the other. And I take it that insofar as we're trying to accommodate the appeals to properties in contemporary philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, what we really need is abundant properties. So we need an account of properties that encompasses all of the properties we represent in thought and language. So this includes, what we might regard as some sort of conceptually fundamental properties, like the property being red, being green, being square, being round. It also obviously includes what we might regard as nomologically fundamental properties, right? Properties dealing with the basic features of the physical world, right? So property of being an electron, being a quark, being positively charged, negatively charged, having a spin of 1/2, and so on, right? These are all the sorts of properties that might show up in a physical theory. But we need more than just these, right? Insofar as we want to account of properties as the contents of predicative thoughts and speech, we need such things as the property of being a chair, a table, a cup, a flask, the property of swimming, skiing, smoking, the property of being a vampire, Strigway, a unicorn. Some of these, I don't know if they're as common in Chinese, but and many, many more, right? There's a vast, vast network of properties that we grasp as speakers and thinkers, and it's in virtue of bearing cognitive relations to these various properties that we're capable of representing things as having these properties. And the fact that we do represent things as having these properties can figure into an explanation of our cognitive and linguistic behavior. Okay. So that's what would be nice to have. It would be nice to have a philosophically acceptable theory of general abundant properties. But there's a problem. Here's the two problems, and I raise these two problems as two questions that are notoriously hard to answer. The first is a metaphysical question. How are properties metaphysically related to the objects that instantiate them, right? So we have this abstract general thing, and we have this particular thing, and the question is, okay, how are these two things related? Second is an epistemological problem. How are we epistemically related to properties so as to have knowledge of them, right? So there are these abstract general things somehow out there, and how are we related to these things such that we can speak of ourselves as knowing them? And I take it that in thinking about these two problems, there's a serious trade-off between, on the one hand, providing an account that gives a satisfactory solution or answer to these questions, and on the other hand, providing an account that encompasses the vast number of properties that I've just mentioned. So that's what I'll say now. So let's start with the metaphysical problem. Here's the core problem. Countenancing the existence of abstract general things, in addition to concrete particular ones, seems to divide the world in two in a problematic way. Here's Peter Van Inwagen. He says, Platonists must say that reality, what there is divided into two parts. One part we belong to, and everything in our part is more like us than anything in the other part. The inhabitants of the other part are radically unlike the things in our part. And given any object, and any given object in the other part is vastly more unlike any object X in our part than anything in our part is unlike X. Sorry, it's the Van Inwagen way of talking. He's just saying we have very, very radically different domains of entities. And here's the kicker, right? He says we can't really say much about what the things in the other part are, right? And I take it the problem wouldn't be so bad if we could say enough about what the things in the other part are so as to understand the relation between the things in the two parts. So here's a quote from Robert Brandom on an unrelated thing, but somewhat related actually. He says, a distinction becomes a dualism when its components are distinguished in terms that make their characteristic relations to one another ultimately unintelligible. So the metaphysical problem is just that once we articulate the world as fundamentally divided between abstract general things and concrete particular things, it seems hard to understand the relation between these two things such that we have an ultimately intelligible story about how there are these two sorts of things in the world. And once again, this is what I said, it's hard to provide an account of properties that explains what it is for an object to instantiate a property while simultaneously accounting for the vast number of properties that I mentioned earlier. So Van Inwagen, who endorses an abundant theory of property, just sort of says, no statement among all possible sets of statements counts as an explanation of what it is for an individual to have a property or for two individuals to have the same property. So he just says, look, there's not going to be any account of what it is for an object to instantiate a property. Here's the sort of thought. There's no general explanation to be given of what it is for something to instantiate the property of being f, other than that it is for it to be f, which of course is nothing other than for it to instantiate the property of being f, right? So there's no real sort of substantive thing we could say in response to this question. And that leaves us with the metaphysical relation problem, which is just what is it for an object and a property to be so related? Now, as I said, I take it if we restrict our attention to a specific class of properties, it seems like we can come up with some more satisfying things to say, and I take it that some people have. So here's one account of properties known as the causal functionalist account. This is notably developed by Sidney Shoemaker, but a number of other people as well. And here's the idea. Natural properties or sparse properties, such as being an electron or being positively charged, these properties are understood in terms of their causal profiles. It's understood in terms of the causal profile of something that has one of these properties. So for instance, right, something's being negatively charged is understood in terms of the causal relations that such a thing bears to other things with other causal profiles. So for instance, attracting positively charged things, repelling other negatively charged things, and so on. And it seems like this does sort of give us something to say about what it is for something to be negatively charged. What is it for something to instantiate the property of being negatively charged? It's for it to have this causal profile, right, which we can spell out in the context of a physical theory. The problem is just that the vast majority of properties remain unaccounted for on this sort of account. So here's Sidney Shoemaker sort of just saying, lots of these things are uncovered by this sort of account, right? So he says, for example, my typewriter has the property of being over 100 miles from the current heavyweight boxing champion of the world. That's a property his typewriter has. But he says, it's not easy to think of a way in which it's having this property could help explain why an event involving it has a certain effect. And for that reason, it's discounted from the account because, what is the causal profile associated with this property? It's hard to say. The issue is that this is precisely the sort of property that could figure in the sort of explanation of semantic competence that I was talking about earlier, referring to Jeff King, right? Where we appeal to speakers' grasps of properties in order to explain why they say what they say when prompted in certain circumstances, right? So for instance, suppose I ask Shoemaker to name something that is over 100 miles from the current heavyweight boxing champion of the world. He thinks for a moment and replies, my typewriter. So that's a real event in the world, and it seems like Sidney Shoemaker's grasp of the fact that his typewriter has the property of being over 100 miles from the current heavyweight champion of the world, his grasp of that property figures in the explanation of why he said what he said, right? This is the sort of explanation of these speakers' behavior that properties are being appealed for in the sort of semantic theory that King suggests, right? So the problem with this causal functionalist account, right, is that we get a satisfying account of some properties, right, namely the ones that occur in our physical theories, but at the expense of leaving out the vast number of properties that are actually appealed to when we think about properties as the contents of predicative thought and speech. Okay, so that's the metaphysical problem. I can say a lot more, but I'll just leave it at that. What about the epistemological problem? So here's the problem. How are we related, cognitively speaking, to properties so as to have knowledge of them? And this is not a particularly easy question to answer. So here's Scott Soames, who appeals to properties in his semantic theory. Now, Soames is not a metaphysician. In some sense he is, but he's primarily a philosopher of language, but he crucially appeals to properties in his philosophy of language. And when pressed on this issue, he just says, well, look, properties, the ways things are, some of them, colors, sizes, shapes, textures, are things we perceive by perceiving their bearers. it's hard to make sense of this thought, and already in Frege, Frege was very clear that general entities, like thoughts and properties, aren't the sorts of things that can be perceived. So here's Frege in the thought. A thought is something imperceptible. Anything the senses can perceive is excluded from the realm of things for which the question of truth arises. That the sun has risen is not an object emitting rays that reach my eyes. It is not a visible thing like the sun itself, right? So Frege is talking about propositions here, right? Propositions like that the sun has risen. But the same point applies to properties like having risen or being round, right? The property of being risen, of having risen, isn't something emitting rays that might hit my eyes like the sun itself. So anything for which the question of true, or you might say true of, right? Because these properties are true of things. Anything for which the question of truth arises isn't a perceptible entity. It's, and this has to do with the fact that properties are essentially general. Here's Frege again. They reach out beyond the particular case so that it's presented to us as falling under something general. Now this is in sort of classic Fregean jargon, but the thought here, right, is that it's in virtue of the generality of properties that they're not the sorts of things to which we can stand in perceptual relations. The things to which we stand in perceptual relations are particulars. Properties are general contents that we bring to bear on the particulars with which we are perceptually presented. So this suggestion, right, that we just perceive properties, it's hard to make sense of. Now, clearly, we can see that something is round, right? So I can look at a planet through a microscope and see, or through a telescope, and see that it's round, right? So you might think, okay, well maybe I can't see roundness itself, but can it be enough to see that things are round and understand what roundness is by virtue of such perceptual episodes? I think not. Because I take it that the right way to conceive of such episodes, of, for instance, seeing that something's round, is something like what this sort of representationalist picture says, right? As involving something like the phenomenal predication of properties to objects. Or, if you read John McDowell will talk about the passive actualization of conceptual capacities in perception. I take it these are ways of talking about the same thing. The crucial thought, right, is that properties are something we bring to bear to perceptual circumstances, right? We're confronted with a particular perceptual circumstance, and these general contents are something we bring to bear in perception. So, insofar as this phenomenal predication is anything like the sort of predication that occurs in judgment, right, and thinking of something that it is round, these episodes presuppose knowledge of properties and so they cannot account for this knowledge. And I take it that really, actually, in fact, this is the fundamental issue in Sellers's empiricism and philosophy of mind, underlying his rejection of traditional empiricist sense data theorists. And I think he takes it that if you think, these perceptual episodes themselves can give you, he'll talk about concepts, right, but also knowledge of properties, this will be an instance of what he calls the myth of the given. And here's a quote from John McDowell about the myth of the given that I like. He says, "Givenness, in the sense of the myth, would be an availability for cognition to subjects whose getting what is supposedly given to them does not draw on the capacities required for the sort of cognition in question." Basically, this is just highlighting the sort of circularity here, right? If you think that you can get knowledge of properties by having perceptual episodes of, for instance, seeing that something is round, you have to understand these perceptual episodes in such a way that doesn't appeal to the very things that are required for having these perceptual episodes, right? So this is the kind of circularity that I take to be here. Now, I'm not going to go through this argument in depth. I just express this argument to give you a sense of the epistemological problem. It's at least not straightforward how we can understand knowledge of properties as perceptual. And I take it the same general concern can be pressed against abstractionist accounts of knowledge of properties of the sort suggested by Russell, but I don't want to go into it here. I just want to sort of raise this problem. It seems very hard to understand how our knowledge of properties could be, at least straightforwardly, perceptual. Okay. Let me run back to the causal functionalist account, right? So we saw in the metaphysical problem, right, that the causal functionalist account could give an account of what it is for an object to instantiate a property but sort of at the expense of only applying to a limited class of properties. So I think you can say the same sort of thing here, although maybe it's a little less obvious. So consider this sort of story, right? We grasp theoretical properties of the sort that figure in mathematically articulated physical theories, such as mass, charge, spin, and so on, by doing mathematical physics, right? This is a very different sort of story than saying we grasp these properties just by perceiving them. No, we grasp them by doing mathematical physics. What does this involve? Well, the physical theory is codified with mathematical equations which prescribe rules for the use of certain symbols, and by mastering these rules, one grasps the theoretical properties expressed by the symbols, right? So I don't do much mathematical physics. I haven't really since high school. For that reason, I would say I don't really grasp what the property of spin is as it's appealed to in physical theories. But how does one who does grasp that property grasp it? They grasp it by doing mathematical physics, by actually using these equations in which this term for this thing figures, mastering the rules governing the use of those equations in those theories, and through that they acquire a grip on the concept. Now, once again, even if this is a satisfying story for this specific class of concepts, it's limited to this specific class of concepts. What I ultimately want to suggest is that our knowledge of even perceptual properties, although obviously not exactly like our knowledge of these theoretical properties, is actually more like our knowledge of these theoretical properties than is widely thought. Okay, so there's these two problems for a theory of properties: the metaphysical problem of articulating the relation between particulars and general things, and the epistemological problem of explaining how it is that we have knowledge of these abstract general things. And in both cases, I've suggested, well, there's at least one account of properties on the market that deals with these problems in a potentially satisfying way, but at the expense of restricting itself to one very small class of properties, these sort of sparse natural properties. So if we could generalize that sort of approach, then perhaps we could get an account of properties in general that avoids these problems. So that's what I'm going to want to propose. So let me start with an articulation of what properties are, and I'm going to approach the question. Of what properties in general are by starting with a question concerning what particular properties are. So here's a question. What is the property of being round? It's a kind of funny thing to ask, but let's actually try to ask it and answer it, right? And see what kind of answer we give and then generalize from that. So here's a not very informative answer. Well, it's a way for something to be shaped. Obvious follow-up question. Which way? Here's a very tempting but completely uninformative answer. Round. Now you might think, okay, there's nothing more we could say here, right? Any attempt to answer this question is just ultimately going to go in a circle in this way. But I want to say we can actually give an completely informative answer to this question. So what is the property of being round? It's a way for something to be shaped such that if something is circular or spherical, then necessarily it's shaped this way. If something's shaped this way, then necessarily there's some central point from which surface points are relatively equidistant. If something's shaped this way, then it can't possibly be square or triangular. If a three-dimensional object under the effect of gravity is shaped this way and placed on an incline, it will generally roll down that incline. And so on, right? I just gave a few examples, but I take it by articulating what it is for something to be shaped round, what it is for something to be round as being shaped in this way, we can completely articulate what this property actually is. So moving from the particular to the general, here's the thought. Properties are modal profiles that things might, or as I'll say, might not as well, have. So this I just gave you is the modal profile of roundness, right? It articulates what it is for something to be round in terms of what some things that shape that way must, cannot, might, will generally do or be. So this account accommodates properties aplenty. So natural properties, right, are just a specific class of these where we're restricting our attention to a particular modality, namely nomological modality, the sort of modality that is characteristic of our physical theories, right? So the causal profile account, which I was just talking about, can be understood as a restriction of the modal profile account to purely nomological modality, right? So the modal profile account, this general account, I want to say, includes the causal profile account of natural properties such as being electron as a sort of proper subset. But beyond this, right, there's a whole bunch of properties that can be understood in terms of their modal profiles, where this isn't, strictly speaking, the causal profile of nomological modality. So for instance, right, the property of being a novella is a modal profile possessed by certain written works of fiction, being longer than a short story but shorter than a full novel, and these properties too are articulated in terms of their modal profiles. Uninstantiated properties, right? So the property of being a vampire, that is a modal profile. It's something, to be a vampire is to be such that one sucks blood, one will not die of natural causes, and so on, right? I can articulate the modal profile, right? It's just that this is a modal profile that nothing possesses, right? And beyond this, impossible properties, right? So consider the property of being a square circle, right? Now lots of people have wanted to say, no, there's no such property as being a square circle. I take it there is. It's just that nothing can possibly instantiate it, right? So just take the modal profile of being a square, of being a circle, say, that I just sort of articulated, right? Take the modal profile of being a square, combine them, and there you go. There's the modal profile, such that if something had that modal profile, it would be a square circle. Now, part of the modal profile of being a square is that if something's a square, it can't possibly be a circle. And part of the modal profile of being a circle is that if something's a circle, it can't possibly be a square. So, if something has the modal profile of being a square circle, it's such that it can't possibly be what it is. But in fact, I think that's exactly what we should say about necessarily uninstantiated or impossible properties, right? They're properties such that if something instantiates them, they couldn't be how they in fact are. So all of the properties that you might want to appeal to, right, including impossible properties, are accommodated on this account. And beyond this, right, we can recursively articulate logically complex properties, right? So logically complex properties can be recursively defined as modal profiles, given modal profiles of simpler properties. So for instance, the property of not being f is the way for something to be, such that if something's this way, its being the way that it is rules out its being f. And if something's f, its being the way that it is rules out its being this way. Similarly, the property of being f or g is the property such that if something's this way and its being the way that it is rules out its being f, then necessarily it's g. And if it's this way and its being the way that it is rules out its being g, then necessarily it's f. So in this way, we can define the modal profiles of logically complex properties given the modal profiles of simpler ones. Now, here's how you can do this formally, right? I'm not going to go into the formal details here, but you can actually do this completely formally, right? So the idea is you take a base set of modal relations of incompatibility and entailment, and then you articulate an account of properties in terms of their bearing these modal relations to one another, and then you can recursively specify the modal relations constitutive of logically complex properties in the way I've just said. So this is what my sort of research group with Bob Random and Ulf Hobel we have done. This is just an advertisement for our work. I'm not going to go into the detail here, but this is precisely what an inferentialist theory of content gives you, right? It gives you an account of contents, and I'm focusing here just on predicative contents, in terms of the modal relations that they bear to one another, right? And given this is all sort of formally tractable. You can articulate this sort of officially. Okay, so this is the view. Properties are modal profiles. Now, this is, I take it, a Platonist account of properties. Properties understood as modal profiles are abstract rather than concrete, right? If you get hit in the face by a baseball, you're getting hit in the face by something that has the modal profile of being round, but it makes no sense to talk about getting hit in the face by the modal profile itself. It's just a category mistake. They're general rather than particular, right? Mickey Mantle is a famous American baseball player. His 500th home run ball, right? That's some particular baseball. Neptune, the sun, they're all different in many ways, but there's some general way that they all are, namely round. That is to say, they're all such that they can't possibly be square and so on, right? This modal profile. They all have this general modal profile, right? So modal profiles are general things that particular things might have. And at least some of them, I want to say, are independent of our cognitive and linguistic activity, right? So the sun was a sphere long before any humans came to be on the scene. And this is understood on this account in terms of how it's being how it is, modally speaking, long before humans came into existence, right? So I've given you a Platonist account of properties. Now I want to make a distinction following Wilfrid Sellars between what I'll call metaphysical Platonism and nominalism and epistemological Platonism and nominalism. This terminology is inspired by Wilfrid Sellars, who distinguishes between metaphysical Platonism and nominalism and psychological Platonism and nominalism. I'm going to use the terms metaphysical Platonism and epistemological Platonism. Okay. So what's metaphysical Platonism? I've just given you a metaphysically Platonist account of properties, and that's the thought that independent of human thought and speech, there exist properties, right? Abstract general things that particular things instantiate. Epistemological Platonism, on the other hand, is the view that a speaker's knowledge of properties explains their ability to correctly use predicates, right? So this is the thought that it's in virtue of bearing cognitive relations to properties that we're capable of mastering the rules governing the use of predicates. So for instance, right, it's in virtue of grasping the property of being round and the property of being square that I know that if I say something is round, I shouldn't say of it that it's square, right? That's epistemological Platonism. Metaphysical nominalism is the view that there really are no properties, just predicates and rules governing their use. Sometimes a view of this sort is expressed by saying that properties are shadows of predicates. That's a kind of metaphysical nominalism, I take it. Epistemological nominalism is the view that one acquires knowledge of properties through mastering the rules governing the use of predicates. Now, Wilfrid Sellars, who I'm inspired by in drawing this distinction, just sort of endorses this bottom row, right? A lot of Sellars' work is articulating an epistemological or psychological nominalist view of our awareness of properties. Sellars says, all awareness is a linguistic affair. And by that, he's expressing this sort of picture where one only has knowledge of properties in virtue of mastering the rules governing the use of linguistic expressions. Sellars, however, is also a metaphysical nominalist. He maintains that there really are no properties, just predicates and rules governing the use. Properties can be understood on Sellars' view as shadows of the rules governing the use of predicates. Now, I've done a lot of work trying to defend Sellars' metaphysical nominalism. Here I'm going to diverge from Sellars and endorse this diagonal. So the view I'm going to try to articulate is metaphysical Platonism along with epistemological nominalism. And I take it that this combination of views actually enables us to have a satisfying view of both the epistemology and the metaphysics of properties. And I think the modal profile view is actually the key to a satisfying epistemology of properties. Okay, so recently, Amy Thomason, in a book called Norms and Necessity, she articulates what she calls a modal normativist account of metaphysically modalized statements, like, if something's spherical, then necessarily it's round. And Thomason's account is that such statements are expressions of semantic rules. And Thomason says that the most important advantage of this view is the epistemological one. right? You can get a satisfying epistemology of our knowledge of metaphysical modal relations by thinking of them in terms of semantic rules, in terms of our mastery of semantic rules. So if the account of properties as modal profiles that I've given you is right, then we can actually extend this modal normativist epistemology beyond just knowledge of modal properties and relations and extend it to properties in general, such that we can understand that knowledge of properties in general is acquired through the mastery of semantic rules. So the approach is sort of, as I understand it, a broadly Wittgensteinian one. So here is a Wittgensteinian question. How am I able to follow a rule? He says, if this is not a question about causes, then it's about the justification for acting this way than that way, right? So when I grasp the use of a predicate, such as red or round, I know how to go on, right, in Wittgenstein's phrase, right? What is the correct epistemological picture of that knowledge? The epistemological Platonist answer is that our cognitive relation to a property, something that stands behind the use, has to justify our going on in that way or that way, right? So the thought is, we grasp these properties and we interpret expressions as standing for these properties, and that interpretation stands behind the use. I take it that there's a rule following problem articulated by Wittgenstein. If you have this picture, there's going to be a regress of interpretations and you'll never get to a satisfying epistemology of our capacity to follow a rule. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to take the following of semantic rules to be epistemologically basic. So here's Wittgenstein again. Once I have exhausted the justifications, I have reached bedrock, and then my spade is turned. Then I am inclined to say, this is simply what I do. And here he says again, when I follow the rule, I do not choose. I follow the rule blindly. So this epistemological nominalist picture starts with our following of the rules, right? This is the basic thing, rather than starting with some knowledge of properties that underlies the knowledge of the rule. So we grasp, on this picture, right, we grasp properties in virtue of mastering the semantic rules, rather than mastering the semantic rules in virtue of grasping the properties. And I think this makes all of the difference to getting a satisfying epistemology of properties. So let me spell this out just a bit. So for instance, here's some rules articulating the correct use of the predicate round. So asserting X is sphere commits one to asserting X is round, in the sense that if one asserts of something that is sphere, if one's pressed to say of it that it's round or not, one's committed to saying that it's round. Asserting that it's round precludes one from being entitled to assert that X is square, and so on. Right? So there's these semantic rules. I take it we sort of master them in virtue of being brought into a linguistic practice. This, as Wittgenstein said, is in the first instance to be understood as something that's blindly done. We don't go into it with a conception of what the rules ought to be. We just sort of start following them. And eventually we acquire a mastery of these rules. Now, here's a Salarzian thought. The language of the modality is to be interpreted as a transposed language of norms. So here is a way of articulating this thought. Our knowledge of the property of being round just leaves our knowledge of the way for some object to be such that its being that way makes correct the use of a sentence of the form X is round. Thus, corresponding to these norms, right, transposing these norms from normative to modal vocabulary, we have X as being a sphere necessitates X as being round, X as being round excludes X as being square, and so on, right? So the thought is that our grasp of the modal profiles with which properties are identified is acquired through our being brought into a linguistic practice, mastering the norms governing the use of linguistic expressions. So many of the properties that we grasp in virtue of mastering the rules governing the use of expressions are instantiated by things in the world independent of our linguistic practice. That is just to say, things in the world independent of our linguistic practice have the modal profiles on which we come to have a grip through mastering semantic norms. However, mastering the rules governing the use of expressions, which can be combined in various ways, confers upon us a grasp of a vast number of properties, both possible and impossible, that are not instantiated, and some couldn't be instantiated. So Adam Pouts actually argues that color properties are like this. This account actually enables you to say that perhaps even color properties aren't instantiated. I'm not going to go into that possibility, but I just acknowledge it as a possibility that you might want to maintain, and in fact can maintain on this account. But for instance, right, we grasp the property of being a vampire, right, by reading works of fiction and watching fictional movies, grasping the rules governing the use of vampire in fictional contexts in which it's used. And by doing mathematics, we grasp a vast number of structural properties that aren't instantiated by anything in the world. So let me just briefly turn back to the metaphysical problem. I take it I've sort of at least sketched an outline of how this sort of account resolves the epistemological problem with properties. We grasp properties in the first instance not perceptually, but through being brought into a linguistic practice, mastering the rules governing the use of linguistic expressions. What about the metaphysical problem, right? How are things related to the things that, how are particular things related to the properties that they have? Well, here, consider, this question. What is the sun? Right? Before I asked what is being round, here's a particular thing. What is the sun? Here's an answer. It's a big ball of plasma. That's one answer to the question, what is the sun, right? It's a star. What's a star? It's a big ball of plasma, right? Something's being a particular big ball of plasma means that it's round, it's hot, and so on. Something's being the particular thing that it is not distinct from it being the general sort of thing that it is. This is a Aristotelian thought articulated here, right? To be anything is to be modal profile, right? You might articulate, right? To be is to make a difference. Seller says that somewhere, right? To be is to make a modal difference. It's to be such that existing certain things necessarily must be other ways or whatnot. So a particular big ball of plasma simply being, existing, is ipso facto for it to be round, to be hot, to gravitationally attract nearby bodies, and so on, right? We're saying these things as shorthand for spelling out the full modal profiles, right? So ultimately, there is no relation problem because there are no separate things to be related. Now, I take it that this is what a lot of people want to say, but I take it that the modal profile account actually gives one the resources to actually spell out what's involved in saying it. Now, one feature of this account is that modality is taken to be fundamental. And this runs in opposition to some contemporary metaphysicians. Ted Sider says, for instance, at bottom, the world is an amodal place. The book of the world says how things are, not how they must or might be. Sorry, I emphasized it wrong. It says how things are, not how they must or might be. On this account, there is no such thing as a thing's being how it is, apart from its being such that it must or might be other things, right? So this approach that Sider expresses here is fundamentally mistaken. And once again, I guess as everywhere, I'm inspired by Sellers. He says, it is only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate these objects in a space of implications that they describe it all rather than merely label, right? So any descriptive vocabulary is implicitly modal. So the thought that there could even be a description of how things are that is not implicitly a description of how they might or might be on this account is fundamentally mistaken. Okay, so that's a few things about instantiated properties. What about uninstantiated properties? So let me just give you an example of a large class of uninstantiated properties. Those articulated by mathematical theory, right? So I take it that mathematics is a general science of structure. Any structure that there could be is a mathematical object. Some of the structures, such as those involved in mathematical physics, are instantiated by empirical reality. Most of them aren't, right? So here's an instantiated structure. Consider the 3x3 Rubik's Cube. There's a mathematical specification of what it is for something to be a Rubik's Cube. It's in this sort of, in group theory, there's a particular group. So that's a mathematical structure that is instantiated by empirical reality. Consider the 100 by 100 Rubik's Cube. That's an abstract specification of the structure that would be instantiated by 100 by 100 Rubik's cubes, but there are no such things. So I think all of these structures can be articulated in modal terms, and these modal profiles can be systematically articulated by a mathematical theory. I take it that they exist, right? There's no reason we need to paraphrase away talking of them. It's just that only a few of them are instantiated. So I've already established there's no epistemological problem with countenancing such things, right? We grasp them by doing mathematics. Is there a metaphysical problem? I don't think there is. Here's David Armstrong, one of the biggest opponents of uninstantiated properties. He says once you have uninstantiated universals, you need somewhere special to put them. A Platonic heaven, as philosophers say. They are not to be found in the ordinary world of space and time. But if universals are non-spatial in the first place, why continue using the spatial metaphor? Why say you need somewhere special to put them at all, when it's clearly misleading in this context? Similarly, right, it's just as mistaken to think that the instantiated modal profiles are somehow located in, albeit non-spatially, the objects that instantiate them. So here's David Lewis, influenced by Armstrong. He says, consider two particles, each having a unit positive charge. Each one contains a non-spatio-temporal part corresponding to charge. One and the same universals recurs in both particulars. It is multiply located. It is wholly present in both particles, a shared common part where the two particles overlap. Being alike by sharing a universal is having something in common in an absolutely literal sense. And Van Inwagen, quoting this, says, such talk bewilders me to a degree that I find it hard to convey. And I'm not going to go into detail, but I take it that once you sort of strip yourself of these metaphors and stop thinking that properties have these features that are analogous to particulars, such as a spatial location, right? Somewhere, where are they, right? I think similar remarks can be made about the sense in which we should say that they necessarily exist or not, or whether they're fundamental in a certain sense. I think a lot of the philosophical problems when it comes from uninstantiated universals arises from importing vocabulary that's applicable to particular things and trying to carry it over to universals, and then it seems like we have to say things about these universals that would give them a problematic metaphysical status. So that's what I want to say about uninstantiated universals at the moment, at least. Okay, just to sum up and circle back, let me just go back to the main questions. Here's the first question, right? The question I asked at the very beginning of this talk. In addition to concrete particular things, are there general and abstract things that these particular things might share or instantiate? Yes. Question two, how are properties, right, these general abstract things, metaphysically related to the objects that instantiate things? They're the modal profiles of these objects that articulate what they can, must, and cannot do, and how they can, must, and cannot be. Finally, how are we epistemically related to properties so as to have knowledge of them? Through mastering the rules governing the use of linguistic expressions, whether these expressions belong to a natural language, such as ordinary English or Chinese, or a specialized language, such as mathematical physics. So I take it that once properties are understood in this way, which avoids the traditional metaphysical and epistemological problems with such things, admitting that they exist is itself unproblematic. 谢谢.
Okay, now let's welcome Professor Liu Chang.
Oh yeah.